Hello, this is Dr. Eugenie Kestel from ACES Education, and I'm joined by Dr. Kate De Bruin from Monash University. Kate and I recently co-authored a systematic review for the Australian Education Research Organisation, AERO. In our research, we identified evidence-based approaches for supporting students in Year 7 to 9 who are significantly behind in literacy and numeracy. One of the main findings from the review was that the most effective framework for designing and providing support for all students at school is through the approach known as multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS. Kate has kindly offered to provide us with a short introduction to MTSS, what it is and how it works. Welcome, Kate.
Thanks, Eugenie. I'm delighted to be able to present the excellent work that you and I did together and a little bit of background in particular about MTSS. So, what is it and how does it support all students' learning? I'd like to go through some of the key components of MTSS because, as we said, it's a framework. And this framework actually grew out of the decades of work that had been done on two other frameworks that viewers of this webinar might be familiar with. They're known as Response to Intervention, or RTI, and Positive Behaviour Support, or PBS. Now, each of these was designed using what we call a multi-tiered approach that actually came out of public health models for disease prevention, how we keep people well and how we return them to being well as quickly as possible. So the framework known as RTI was essentially focused on academic instruction and intervention, and PBS was essentially focused on behaviour. Research is now clear, though, that as viewers will surely have already thought, that academics and behaviour are really closely linked. They're not best dealt with in isolation. For example, we know that students who can't access the curriculum, they might lack the foundational skills to access the curriculum, like reading or writing, and those students can become very disruptive. So we know that just providing some kind of behavioural response isn't addressing the issue that student has and ensuring they make good progress. So MTSS is now the umbrella term that encompasses both. MTSS is a proactive and a preventative framework for providing quality instruction to all students, and then providing support on the basis of need. Now, it's not a special needs approach. It doesn't assume that some students need something very different or that they learn differently. Instead, MTSS assumes that all students can learn and that they learn really the same way, but that some might need teaching and instruction to be more targeted and intensive and responsive to what they need. So the framework contains this foundation on which everything else rests, which is high quality instruction for all students and no exceptions. And then on top of that sits a coordinated system, which is layers of more intensive instruction, and a robust system for screening students to make sure you've picked up anyone that might need some additional assistance to make good progress. And then you use that information to provide the right support at the right time at the right level of intensity. So the whole framework relies on using really good quality data about your students. Data is used to identify students who are underperforming, and then data and research evidence are used to select the right evidence and supports that would appropriately meet the needs of that child in terms of improving skill acquisition or perhaps their fluency in executing skills. Data are also used to then monitor how well any interventions and supports are working and making sure that they are supporting student progress as expected. So let's briefly go over some of these components. And I've taken this nice graphic from the MTSS for Success website, and the link's there at the bottom. So firstly, MTSS is a coordinated system. Tiers 2 and 3, those additional layers of support that can exist on top of Tier 1, which is that instruction provided for everybody. Tiers 2 and 3 do not replace Tier 1. They're not something different. They are the same stuff, but more often, more intensively delivered. So what do we mean by more intensively? Well, first of all, it often means that students are in smaller groups or even accessing that instruction individually. So they're getting much more intensive attention and learning experiences with a teacher. They've got more opportunities to respond to instruction, and they get more frequent corrective feedback and also assessed more frequently so that their progress is very closely monitored. This is what we mean by intensification. The next one is evidence-based practice. So at every level, practices that are used for teaching and assessment are supported by research evidence, robust and a large quantity of research evidence. The third one is that rather than relying, as was often previously done, on some kind of assessment done out of the school, perhaps by medical or allied health teams who might have been trying to consider the nature of any student impairment that used to be thought maybe underpinned student poor performance, we now just assume that all students can learn if given the right amount of instruction, and that assessment, the basic screening, is best done by teachers in schools. And it's best done using measures that are fairly closely related to the curriculum, some kind of general outcome measure of what the curriculum has taught. And that screening is often done 3 times a year, a kind of beginning, middle and end of the year. But it can be more frequent in some things like spelling, for example. It might even be done weekly using the curriculum itself. So teams use the data from that screening and other data sources and look at that in teams. So the team should contain people who are teachers, who know what's being taught. They should contain people who are data literate and who know how to work with data. They should have also on the team should be someone who has the power to make resourcing decisions. Teams should also be able to access a suite of options that already exist in a school so they can get something up and running straight away. The options that they have to support students in schools should have research evidence to support their efficacy, because that boosts everybody's confidence that what you're doing has a really high likelihood of the outcome that you want for these students. So it's really important data and research evidence are used to match the right support to the student. You then need to make sure that you're monitoring student progress. Even if you've chosen a really well supported, evidence-based practice or program for a student, you can't just assume it's going to work perfectly for that student. You do need to monitor progress, and that should also be done using kind of robust measures for monitoring progress, partly because student underachievement needs to be addressed quickly. Gaps in learning and behaviour need to be closed as quickly as possible, but also Tier 2 and 3 supports are resource intensive. So schools need to have the confidence that they're devoting those precious resources in the right way and achieving the outcome that everybody wants. So I've got a worked example here to present. As I said, MTSS is a preventative model. So we're talking about that little part of the framework there that I've got a red circle for you. So it's coordinated across those tiers. We're not doing something different at Tier 2. We're providing more intense instruction and learning at Tier 2. So again, we assume that all students are capable of learning with the right amount of quality instruction. So MTSS is about, well, how much quality instruction does this one need? So at the foundational tier, which everybody accesses, classroom instruction, for example, that's designed to support the learning and progress of the most diverse cohort possible. And it reserves those precious resources for students who might need them at Tier 2 and 3, only if you've already ensured that they're getting high quality instruction to start with. It would be a wasteful use of resources to provide Tier 2 and 3 intervention if you haven't ensured that Tier 1 instruction is right. And you should be thinking about that as roughly enough for 80% of your students. If you're getting more, less, so if too many students need that support, if you haven't hit that kind of roughly 80% mark, then you're likely to overwhelm the resources of your school. It wouldn't be possible to provide, for example, Tier 2 intervention to 40% of your students. So in that instance, you adjust that tier 1 instruction and make sure that that's as high quality as possible, and you invest your resources there to get to that 80% level. So what do you do if you're in a school where you've got beautiful high quality instruction, teachers have had access to excellent professional learning, you know, you've got all of that in place? What do you do with the students who aren't in that 80%? What do you do for the 20% who aren't meeting expectations? So that's when you strategically target students by identifying what need they haven't got. I'd like to look a little bit more detail at, sorry, I forgot to do my red circles. So MTSS presumes that in the 20% who aren't meeting expectations at tier 1, that offering support at tier 2 will be sufficient for roughly 15% of them. Now, what is tier 2? It's usually offered in small groups, and it's usually offered in a time-limited manner. So a common example might be, for example, for student behaviour. If you take a small group of students who are persistently avoiding school or becoming disruptive, you can use evidence-based interventions like check-in, check-out. They're time limited, and you monitor the impact, and it's enough for that small group of students. For students who have much more substantial and significant disruptive or harmful, dangerous behaviours, you might be looking at providing very intensive one-to-one support, using a multidisciplinary team, wrapping those supports around children and their families, and so on. But none of that works if you don't get tier 1 right. If you get tier 1 right, and if you have evidence-based supports offered at tier 2, you could be seeing progress and students meeting expectations 95% of your cohort. So that's the goal. That's the goal for MTSS. So let's talk about tier 1. We talk about evidence-based practices, and what those are universal practices for delivering the core curriculum. And by the core curriculum, I mean, of course, the academic curriculum, as well as those personal and social and emotional capabilities that are in the general capabilities in the curriculum. Tier 1 is provided for everybody. You use evidence-based instruction. It should be aligned with grade level standards, and you're offering this in the general education classroom. And in the case of behaviour, you're offering it in all school environments, wherever the students are at. Tier 2, they're carefully targeted practices for students who are at risk of poor outcomes. So if you're starting to see chronic absence problems, low attainment in reading, writing, or mathematics, for example, we're talking about those students. And then you provide carefully targeted supplemental instruction in those academic or general capabilities to small groups who have a shared identified area of underperformance. So there's no use in providing a reading intervention for a student with poor writing outcomes, for example. You've got to carefully align those. Now, generally, tier 2 could be offered in the classroom, or it could be offered in small group withdrawal settings, but carefully targeted and with an exit plan. Remember, tier 2 isn't a long-term plan. It's not a sort of parking lot. There's no such thing as a tier 2 student. There's just tier 2 supports that are offered on a time-limited basis. Tier 3 are those intensive practices, highly individualised, and they should be for students who haven't responded to both tier 1 and tier 2. In general, you'll be trialling tier 2 first. And if tier 2 hasn't worked, you need to have monitored to make sure that you've chosen the right program for the kid, or the practice for that kid. So tier 3 is highly resource intensive, and it's only delivered really for individuals, and should only be reserved for students for whom everything else has been tried first. In rare exceptional cases, such as students who are engaging in very dangerous or harmful behaviours, you may look at jumping straight to tier 3 wraparound support. I've got a link at the bottom of the page here, Eugenie, which is a link to the highleveragepractices.org. And that's a lovely set of resources around not just what are evidence-based practices, but which ones are the highest leverage, which ones are likely to make the most impact and should be part of the repertoire of all teachers. So now let's talk about universal screening and progress monitoring, which are those parts of the framework up there. So universal screening uses a systematic process for identifying students who might be at risk of poor learning outcomes, social, academic, emotional, school completion, and so on. So all students are screened. It's at tiers 2 and 3 where you engage in progress monitoring, but you need to be using robust tools and measures for doing that. You might, for tier 2 and 3, you might look at some more what we call diagnostic assessments, and I don't mean medical assessments by that, but for example, if a student's making poor progress in reading at tier 1, and you've used a general outcome measure of reading, you might then engage in some more diagnostic, targeted supplemental assessments to understand whether there are some issues in the student's phonemic awareness, for example, or whether there's a decoding issue or fluency issue, vocabulary issue, and that's where you target your tier 2 intervention to make sure that you're providing the support at the right area of reading that student hasn't attained. So Eugenie, we've got some questions that you've received. I'd be happy to answer them.
We have. Thank you so much for that, Kate. That was very informative and did sum up the findings from our evidence review, which is great and a bit more palatable perhaps for some people rather than churning through the written report. So thank you so much for that. I'll just share my screen with everyone, and we've got some questions here that have come up from teachers and school leaders concerning MTSS. So here's the first one. MTSS, Kate, is this simply the next big thing in education? So is it just something else that teachers who are already feeling stretched will be asked to do?
I love this question. The short answer is no. What it will replace is an entire approach and way of doing things, but you're not adding it into your repertoire. It's not the next big thing and one new thing, one more thing. You know, the last few years in this pandemic have placed enormous burdens on teachers and school leaders. And MTSS is not the next thing to add on top of your list. Engaging in this will, in fact, relieve some of the persistent issues that schools are facing. So if we think about, I'm in the state of Victoria. Many of our students went through extended periods of remote learning. And while some students thrived in those, others didn't. And it's had some impact on academic skills. So students who couldn't read and write before the lockdowns didn't really learn as effectively as they might have, but also some self-regulation skills and social skills. There's some mental health fallout from those. So schools are really struggling with some of those. They could potentially be having their resources overwhelmed by trying to address the really substantial needs presented by these students. So by taking an MTSS approach, schools can take a cool-headed look at what's going on in the tier 1 classroom and getting that, that kind of bang for your buck there. So if you're in a school and you are potentially having your resources overwhelmed, trying to provide that, one-on-one support for students who are struggling, this is a way of doing as much as you can in the classroom. So it's a more efficient model than the previous approach. So in one sense, it is the next big thing. It's a way that schools can restructure their approach, but it's not on top of everything you've always done before. It's rethinking the way you've always done things and asking, is this getting the outcomes that we want? Are we happy? Are we getting enough students thriving and succeeding through regular instruction? And if we're not, let's start there. Eugenie, I just want to add that I work with so many schools around instruction and intervention, and so many come to me asking for help with tier 2. And I have to gently say, I'd like to have that conversation with you. Let's look at tier 1 first, because invariably they're getting more students needing tier 2 or 3 support than they can cater to, and they have waiting lists. So MTSS offers schools a way to address all of that at the whole school level.
Thanks, Kate. And I think I've heard you say before, which I thought was a very eloquent way to put it, is that you can't intervene your way out of a tier 1 problem. And I
No,
think that really,
I didn't. I don't think I came up with that phrase, but I do use it often because it's so apt. Tier 1 instruction can take 2 years to get right in schools where there are, pressures that have created issues there. So that is the greatest investment that schools can make.
excellent. And we're really hoping that that message gets through. And I also remember reading that MTSS, I think it was by someone who's been using this for some time in the US, that MTS isn't the next big thing, it's the thing.
Yeah, it's the only thing. Yes, I've read that too.
Okay, so on to our next question, which is, how does MTSS differ from RTI?
Good question. So MTSS is the term that's currently now used most commonly, but it refers to both frameworks. It doesn't eliminate them. RTI came about 20 years ago. It was written into law in the United States, but it actually drew on a number of movements and a substantial amount of research that came before, particularly in relation to learning difficulties. So, and with the largest area of research and attention paid to reading. It used to be assumed that if students weren't acquiring reading skills, that they must have some kind of disability that was an explanatory factor. In other words, it was considered to be a within student problem. And the little attention was ever paid to whether they'd accessed quality instruction to start with. And they used to rely on this assessment called the IQ Achievement Discrepancy Assessment to see if they could explain away poor performance, which I actually personally find very objectionable because it doesn't matter what your IQ is, you can learn. It's just that the pace may be slower. But nonetheless, that attention was paid to that problematic assessment process. Way too many students were being identified for needing what were called in the US, because all this research happened in the US. And so too many students were being referred to obtain funding and access special educational services. And the number of those students was growing at a rate that far outstripped the number of students needing services under any other kind of disability category. So a lot of attention was paid to that. And a huge amount of research, things like precision teaching, and a lot of initiatives began where they said, how can we identify these students sooner? If you're going to release funds to access special educational services based on a disability category, you have to have a couple of years of underachievement performance data to show that the problem is a sustained problem, which means you're waiting for a child to fail. So RTI was this initiative that came about that said, how can we monitor students' progress in schools without waiting for the kind of medical professionals and without waiting for failure? How can we catch them before they fall? So RTI was actually tied in with a whole lot of research around this, what we now call screening. How do we pick these kids up really quickly? And then at the same time, a lot of research was being done in relation to reading. The US National Reading Panel report came out, for example. And the parents of kids with learning disabilities who were being placed into special ed classrooms weren't actually being given high quality academic instruction and going back to general ed. They were getting a lot of sort of basic instruction, life skills, functional curriculum, but they weren't ever having the gaps closed. So a whole lot of forces came together around reading, around quality tier 1 instruction, and around minimizing the huge numbers of kids that were being pulled out of classrooms and sent somewhere else for something else with someone else. So all of that came together to be RTI. And there were some nationally funded research institutes in the US that were doing some fabulous work around that. Now, in parallel, similar work was being done in PBS. So we had these research centres that were largely disconnected from each other, focusing on turning this public health approach into a way to respond to students with difficulties in reading and writing and mathematics or in behaviour. And it's taken 20 years in the our research, as you know, found that over that 20-year period, there's been a convergence, and people are now much more commonly using MTSS to encompass both. So RTI is a multi-tiered framework. It's an example of a multi-tiered system of support and sits under it as an umbrella term.
Thank you, Kate. Okay, the next question is just sharing my screen. Sorry about that. Is MTSS effective for supporting both primary and secondary students? Because obviously this report looked at secondary, but does it support primary and secondary, Kate?
MTSS is an effective approach for both, but it doesn't look identical in both. And as the bulk of the research has been done in reading, I'll use a reading example to illustrate that. Foundational reading skills are the curriculum in the early primary years. So in, the first 3 years of schooling, students should be learning to crack the alphabetic code and turn print to speech and speech to print. So reading and writing should be taught, and students should be acquiring those very basic fundamental and foundational skills. So these multi-tiered approaches paid huge attention to those years in particular, and that's where the wealth of knowledge that we have is. We now have a fairly good, but not as big, body of research to say, what do you do for those students in kind of grade 3 and beyond? And that's when the students are still only just a little bit behind. So in primary schools, that getting tier 1 right in those first 3 years of school, making sure that you get almost every child reading and writing. And then if you're intervening in the kind of grades 3 to 6 years, then you're trying to close a small gap. Now, if students get to high school and they're still only reading and writing in a level expected in those very early primary years, that gap is enormous. So in the first 3 years, you'll be screening foundational skills progress 3 times a year and maybe doing a little bit of differentiation and kind of small scale support to keep kids making progress. You won't be doing that in grades 3 to 6. You already know they're behind, so you're providing some fairly rapid response there. But if we're dealing with a gap of 4 or 5 years of expected progress, it's urgent and critical. So high schools, as we found in our report, high schools should be screening students upon entry. It isn't advised that you solely rely on things like the A to E grades that have been reported in subject areas, or that you solely rely on NAPLAN scores, which we know have quite a low minimum and won't be catching all the students that are actually underachieving. So those data sources are very helpful and useful and should come across in the transition information that high schools get. But as we found in our review, schools should really be screening students upon entry using the quickest measures possible to screen a large number of students and pick up any unexpected areas of low progress and intervening immediately. So that's really the key difference is in terms of those foundational skills. But the same logic holds. High quality tier 1 instruction should be enough to support students to make good progress. In high schools, when you're no longer dealing with a foundational skills curriculum, that might look like things like using explicit instruction to teach knowledge and concepts, using a gradual release of responsibility to make sure students can increasingly work independently with those skills and concepts, teaching disciplinary literacy. And there's some fantastic work that's come out of the Evidence for Learning group around what that might look like in a secondary school. And one of the other key findings in our review was around self-regulated strategy development, which is a fantastic approach that teachers can get PD in using and apply to any curriculum, and can be used to do both high quality tier 1 instruction as well as targeted small group instruction at tier 2 for any curriculum.
Thank you, Kate. Yes, and that was a strong finding across a number of areas, which was the SRSD. Okay, I think we have one more question. Let's have a look. Oops. So this is another one that's come through. MTSS seems to require a lot of assessment. So how do teachers fit these into an already busy assessment schedule?
Yeah, what a great question. Well, the way you do that is by taking, as I said before, a really cool-headed look at the assessments you're already using. Do you need to use them all? A lot of the schools that I work with ask this question, but they also tell me they don't use the data from all the assessments. So you don't have to fit it in on top of your existing assessment schedule. It may well replace some of those. And you may actually get better data, and that data may be able to be used to inform instruction in a much more responsive way. The other is that a lot of the assessments used in MTSS are extremely quick. So if we take, for example, the running records that have been popular for so long in a balanced literacy approach, they are done one-on-one with the student and they take a fairly long time. Teachers can do the kinds of reading assessments using an MTSS approach, and they're so much faster. We're talking a couple of minutes per child. So that you might be adding in more assessments, but they are much quicker. And so it will actually not be as burdensome on your time, which means that doing them 3 times a year can inform your instruction. You can redesign your instruction to make sure you're addressing areas of low growth in the classroom, as well as picking up those students who might need something additional at Tier 2.
Thank you. So what you're saying, Kate, really is that one of the first ways that schools can perhaps start implementing a multi-tiered system of support is to perhaps look at the assessments that they're currently doing and the data that that provides, and do a bit of an audit to decide, are we using that data? Is it helpful? And perhaps replacing some of the existing assessments rather than adding more.
Absolutely. And also, if you've got data that shows that you're not getting growth in the areas that you've been devoting significant resources to, then that points to, is what we're doing working in teaching and assessment? So it is a really integrated framework. Schools that change their assessments are schools that will already be schools who've bought into the idea that perhaps they might need to adjust how they are designing their teaching. So, approaches to reading is a good example, but it's not the only, it's not the only example. So if schools are looking at disciplinary data, for example, but if the school has largely adopted a punitive approach to students, then it doesn't matter what tools you use to assess, whether students are behaving in your school. If you aren't creating those positive learning environments, and if you aren't teaching expected behaviours in ways that are supportive of a really diverse cohort, then you're going to continue to get poor data. So assessments can be a good place to start, but it's not necessarily the only place to start.
Thank you so much. So MTSS is already gaining momentum in some schools, certainly on the east coast of Australia. So I'm sure that we're going to hear a lot more about this, and you and I have planned some more work in this space. So if people want extra information in the meantime, they can email me, and this is all on our website as well, .org.au. And I'll just share that with you. That email address, eugenie@aceseducation.org.au. Thank you so much, Kate, for your time this morning and your very informative explanation of MTSS that gives schools and school leaders and teachers a bit of an introduction into this very exciting, as we found, and they have in the US, possibly game-changing innovation. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Bye.